I decided to sit down and record a video on why I don't like Miles Morales. Um, we need to start this off by saying I like the version of him that's in the Into the Spider Verse movie. That was a well written character. That movie was so, what's the way of saying it, is so well liked by me that I actually would probably say I still find him to be the least interesting character in it, which is not an insult towards that version of the character, but more so to say that a lot of the other Spider-Man characters in that film were interesting to me. Like I really like that movie's version of Doc Ock. I really like Peter B. Parker. Spider Gwen. I thought all of them were interesting, could be fleshed out more. But again, you could argue that that's because we've seen them as who they are as opposed to seeing them begin, which was the case with Miles in that movie. So again, that version of the character, I give an A+ to. I think he's really good. Um, and when I say others are more interesting to me, I'm not saying that as an insult. That's just because the bar was set so high up. Um, but let's start with some background information. So I used to read Ultimate Spider-Man by Brian Michael Bendis in the early 2000s, or I guess late 2000s, as Miles introduced in 2011. And I really liked that alternate version of Peter and the different takes that Bendis had on some classic Spider-Man stories. So I like a story when the hero gets to retire or get a happy ending. This is why a lot of times, if I reread earlier issues of Spider-Man, I like to stop at the issue where he gets married to Mary Jane because I can just imagine them living happily ever after that. Even though I know, based off of the stuff that's come out in the last 30 years, that's not the case. Um, so when I read Ultimate Spider-Man now, and it's still a good series, I wouldn't speak negatively of it. It's bittersweet knowing that this version of Peter is going to sacrifice himself and his life over and over again to save other people. And his reward is to die excessively prematurely after a year of heroics. And you might say to yourself, okay, well, that's just a problem of that series, doesn't have to do with Miles, the character. But that ending of Peter dies so that a new Spider Man in the shape of Miles can take over is something that has stayed with other iterations of the character, including the Into the Spider Verse movie. So I heavily associate the character of Miles with a bad ending or a unpleasant fate for Peter, a character I care way more about because I mean it's to me he is Spider-Man even if other characters are. But listen, Miles probably I think would be a lot more appealing to me if they did it like Batman Beyond where they let Peter retire as Spider-Man, whether that's, at the age of 16 as he was when he died in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, or they let him, just retire at some point, right? And then Miles takes over and then Peter acts kind of like a guide for him. Just he's still involved in the story to an extent, but he's not, you know, the titular protagonist. Let's get into this race thing. So I would say Miles is not a bad character to me. I just find him extremely similar to Peter. Like, and I know he has the electric powers and the invisible thing, but I'm saying that. And there was another person who made a video on this. I don't think I need to say who it is because most people probably will already know who it is because his video has way more views than mine. But this person was talking about how if you read a comic where Miles is Spider-Man and he shows up, unless the costume is different, which it is, you can't even tell it's a different character. They both make jokes. They're both kind of, I guess, shy at certain points. Like his personality seems almost completely identical to Peter, to where you would almost ask, well, what's the point if the character is going to act the same way? And that's why for me, Miles has always felt kind of like a overpropped discount version of Ben Riley, who was an actual clone, and during the Clone Saga was thought of briefly to take over the mantle of being Spider-Man, with the idea that him being this single version of Peter reminded people of earlier stories before Spider-Man was married to Mary Jane, and that this harkened back to an earlier period. So it made sense because of him being a clone that they acted similar to each other and it had a purpose. And it also didn't have, in my opinion, the screwed up conclusion for Peter's character of him being killed off so that somebody else can take over the position. In the case of Ben, Peter and Mary Jane we're going to go live somewhere with their daughter. Uh, in the case of Miles, they kill Peter off to set Miles up as the hero. And you can say, okay, that's just an Elseworld story. It's an alternate universe, but that's an alternate universe that I, as a reader, and other readers, even longer because I didn't read Ultimate Spider-Man when it first came out. I was 2. If I remember correctly, it came out in 2000, so I would have been 2 at the time. Um, that version of Peter from the 161, I don't know the numbers. The Ultimate Universe had become someone that the readers cared about over the course of 100+ issues. So he's almost indisputably the most significant version of the character outside of, again, in comics, outside of the one that's been showing up since 62. And to give him a bad ending and have that be Miles' introduction still rubs me the wrong way even today. But we've gotten into how I don't feel his character is distinct from Peter's. And it really sucks too because I like having a Spider-Man having a version of Spider-Man who has different supporting characters. I like that Miles's, family is around his parents, but I never felt as if they were really used as effectively as they should be, or like used often enough. It just felt like there was, what's the way of saying it? Um, there was more attention paid to giving Miles a, in my opinion, cool costume than there was to actually giving him stories that were different. It's just person puts on a mask, secret identity, they go and do stuff. And it's hard to admit this, but I also want to get into this thing as well. I don't like the idea of a black superhero being taking up the mantle for a white one because I think, and look, I know the message of the Spider-Verse movie was Spider-Man can be anybody, but in my mind, I associate, when I think of Spider-Man, I think of Peter Parker. When I think of Superman, I think of Clark Kent. When I think of Batman, I think of Bruce Wayne. So to me, those titles, even if they are mantles, are heavily associated with one specific character. It's not like Robin, where, even then, most people think of Dick Grayson, but it's been, worn by other people. Um, I probably would like him more if he was like a partner to Spider-Man, like if they made him have a different name and then he was, like, because a lot of people don't like black sidekicks, but maybe just his partner, kind of like how Black Cat is, uh, except without the romantic tension. But you get my point that I think if it says something about, I'll put it this way: if I wanted to make a version of Black Panther who was white, people would know that that's kind of not a thing you would do for that particular character and his successor. And with the role of Spider-Man, I just wish that if we're gonna have, if Marvel's gonna push their thing of having more minority superheroes or other types, that represent different minority groups, they would let them be unique. Like, how about instead of giving me a black version of Iron Man, just another example, why can't I just get a black person that is smart and likes to build armors as well? Call him something else. Like, I'd be a lot more content with Miles if his introduction wasn't let's kill off Peter. And which, again, I want to quantify this by saying Spider-Gwen has a similar introduction where her story starts with kill off Peter as well, but it's an alternate version that wasn't even Spider-Man that we didn't get to know for over 10 years. Um, and I just wish that if we have black superheroes, they're allowed to have their own identity. Like, why does this character have to piggyback off of a white character's mantle or title? If I wanted to make a role model for black children, um, and let's say I want him to be kind of like Batman, right? I would have a person who is brooding, who goes at it out at night. You know, maybe they can be wealthy, they're smart as well. They train, they do various things, but I wouldn't call them or try to make them a successor to Batman because I want them to retain their own identity. It's why I've never liked the idea of Dick Grayson permanently taking over as as Batman in the comics, because I like that character and want him to have his own identity. And again, that doesn't mean I'm always against different identities. Like when with the thing with Ben, the reason I bring him up during these talks is to say that I think the idea of Peter having a successor as Spider-Man was done better in other stuff, like with Spider-Girl, for example, where um, her identity, even though it's obviously based off her father, is still her own identity. So I don't hate Miles. I'm not a fan of him. Um, I can think of 10 alternate versions of Spider-Man that I find more interesting and just better executed. And it sucks too because I don't like disliking black superheroes, and I don't really like him for the reasons I stated here, except for Into the Spider-Verse. But in the comics, he's just Peter Parker with darker skin, and that doesn't appeal to me. Um, and it sucks.